27% drop in fentanyl seizures from January compared to December, to a near zero low of less than half an ounce seized in January, even with all the further enforcements and actions we've taken at the borders. In sum, we stepped up. We engaged closely and constructively with the President and his administration. We did everything we promised. We stuck to our word. And we did it because we believe in working together to protect our citizens. Now I want to speak directly to one specific American, Donald. In the over 8 years you and I have worked together, we've done big things. We signed a historic deal that has created record jobs and growth in both of our countries. We've done big things together on the world stage, as Canada and the US have done together for decades, for generations. And now we should be working together to ensure even greater prosperity for North Americans in a very uncertain and challenging world. Now, it's not in my habit to agree with the Wall Street Journal, but Donald, they point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do. We two friends fighting is exactly what our opponents around the world want to see. And now, to my fellow Canadians, I won't sugarcoat it. This is going to be tough, even though we're all going to pull together, because that's what we do. We will use every tool at our disposal so Canadian workers and businesses can weather this storm. From expanding EI benefits and making them more flexible to providing direct supports to businesses, we will be there as needed to help. But Canada, make no mistake, no matter how long this lasts, no matter what the cost, the federal government and other orders of government will be there for you. We will defend Canadian jobs. We will take measures to prevent predatory behavior that threatens Canadian companies because of the impacts of this trade war, leaving them open to takeovers. We will relentlessly fight to protect our economy. We will stand up for Canadians every single second of every single day, because this country is worth fighting for. Les derniers mois
The recent months have been stressful and, in fact, exhausting for all of us. But I believe we can be reassured by the incredible solidarity we've seen among Canadians. Solidarity among businesses, among unions, the civil society, Indigenous communities, and all Canadians. All of Canadian society is speaking with a single voice so that we can be heard by our U.S. partners and to illustrate that the imposition of these tariffs is a very bad idea. At the same time, we are working internally to remove the barriers to internal trade between the provinces and territories. We're working to try and reach new markets around the world to build an economy even more strong and resilient than before. In recent years, I've had a number of opportunities to talk to global leaders, and my message is always the same. Canada is a reliable partner, and our door is wide open. In recent weeks, we have also redoubled our efforts to work with Mexico, which is also being hit with these tariffs. Together, we will seek new ways of working together and to provide mutual support in the face of this threat. In the face of uncertainty and worry, Canadians have shown so much solidarity. I saw you sharing lists of Canadian products to help your loved ones and friends and support Canadian businesses. I saw you change your travel plans to stay in Canada rather than going to the United States. I saw you redouble your efforts to support our small businesses and our workers here in Canada. I saw you defend our culture and ensure it can flourish. I saw you encourage our athletes with incredible fervor, and I thought I could never be even prouder of my country and my compatriots. And yet, I still have something to ask of you. Do not give up. This is the time to redouble your efforts, to stand up for our country, to do everything we possibly can to choose Canada and defend Canada. Together, we will get through some tough times. But after seeing you and seeing your reaction in recent weeks, I have to say, I have never been as optimistic with respect to the future of our beautiful country, in spite of all the challenges we're facing right now. Canada remains the best country in the world. We have so many reasons to be proud of our home, to be proud of our land, but I'm especially proud of our ability to come together when that is required. Canadians of different backgrounds, who speak different languages, have different religions. But, you know, when it comes time to defending our country, we speak with a single voice and walk hand in hand. In spite of all, Canadians will always be relying on each other.
Now, we've been through tough spots before. But every time we've faced long odds and seemingly insurmountable obstacles, we've not only survived, we've emerged stronger than ever. Because when it comes to defending our great nation, there is no price we all aren't willing to pay. And today is no different. Merci beaucoup, mes amis.
Thank you, friends.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. Merci beaucoup. We will now take 20 minutes of questions. Nous prendrons 20 minutes de questions. One question, one follow-up, une question, un suivi. Merci.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Perry with CBC. You're reaching out to the President today. You're speaking directly to him. We heard from U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, who says that Donald Trump will be speaking to Canadians. And he also says that he wants to see more progress on fentanyl. So my question to you is, do you have any conversation scheduled with Donald Trump in the coming days? Is that something maybe your successor should do? And do you really believe that this is about fentanyl, or is there something larger at play here?
I have offered to speak to Donald over the past number of days, and I expect to speak with him in the days to come. I'm always there to talk with him about the importance of working together to take on the world at this time. The facts show very clearly that in terms of taking action on fentanyl, we are doing everything that is necessary, and not just for the United States, for ourselves as well, as Canadians are suffering as well from the scourge that is illegal fentanyl. We have laid out extensive plans, actions, cooperations, including as recently as the past days in Washington, and they have always been very well received. And the numbers bear that out. I think in what President Trump said yesterday, that there is nothing Canada or Mexico can do to avoid these tariffs, underlines very clearly what I think a lot of us have suspected for a long time, that these tariffs are not specifically about fentanyl, even though that is the legal justification he must use to actually move forward with these tariffs.
Monsieur Trudeau, en français, à part l'allocution que vous avez eue envers Monsieur Trump, lui avez-vous parlé au cours des derniers jours, des dernières
Have you
heures?
spoken to Mr. Trump recently? No. I made myself available to talk to him in recent days, as we did a month ago, and I hope to be able to speak to him in the coming days, and I'm always open to doing that.
This off the top, you're seeing the United States seemingly moving closer to Moscow. This is the same day that the United States has announced it's suspending aid for Ukraine. The Kremlin just said that U.S. foreign policy now is in alignment with Russia. So how do you successfully, or your successor, successfully negotiate with a president who seems to regard his friends as his enemies and his enemies as his friends?
In this regards, Canada and Canadians are very clear. We know who our friends are. We know who our opponents are, and there is no question that Vladimir Putin and his attack not just on Ukraine, but on the rules-based international order, on the founding principles of the United Nations, is an opponent of Canada. I think the question that we all need to be watching closely is, what do the American people think? How do Americans feel about jettisoning one's friends and allies in favor of a country that has never wished Americans well and continues to act in ways that harm the global economy and specifically the American economy and American values and principles?
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau, Valérie Gavage de Radio-Canada.
Radio-Canada, I'd like you to talk about potential relief programs. In Quebec, they're talking out the possibility of 160,000 jobs being lost. There are plants closing already. Now, is there something on the table today that you can tell Canadians in order to try and mute the effect of these tariffs? Well, there are things that we will be looking at immediately when it comes to the employment insurance program, but I want to remind Canadians that our goal is not to find ways for Canadians to get through these tough times. It is to prevent these tough times from lasting any more than they absolutely have to. If we can have those tariffs removed tomorrow, that's what we will try to do. Our priority is to put an end to this economic war, and the fact that Americans will immediately be facing layoffs and problems with respect to their own consumer products will certainly help us to put an end to this challenge as quickly as possible. But in fact, we are looking at a number of options, a number of things that we can do if those tariffs remain in place longer than a day or two, even with the immediate review of UEI programs that we might want to tweak.
Foremost, as we reflect on the impacts on Canadian workers and Canadian jobs and businesses, is that, first of all, there will be similar impacts on Americans losing their jobs, American families paying more for basic goods that they rely on at a time where times are tight everywhere. But our focus has to be on getting these tariffs lifted as quickly as possible. What can we do in the coming days is our focus to make sure that these tariffs don't last a second longer than necessary. So we will be looking at, including looking in the coming day at things we can do around adjusting EI to support people through this difficult time. But our priority has to be not on figuring out how to manage through these tariffs over the coming days and weeks and months, but on doing everything we can to get them lifted and put an end to this unjustified trade war that hurts American families and Canadian families.
On a l'impression que vous n'avez plus beaucoup de cartes dans votre jeu.
I think you don't have that many cards left to play. Now, would the renegotiation of the CUSMA agreement be a way to address this? Well, right now, in our conversations with the President, it's not very clear what he's actually trying to do or what he wants. Perhaps the only clarity is what he's said a number of times, which is that his goal is to ruin the Canadian economy so that he can then move on to annex the country. That's what he wants. So I'm not sure. I'm not really certain what kind of negotiation could go forward right now that would convince him that this is the right thing to do. And really, what we have to do is demonstrate that our economies are very closely linked and that these kinds of barriers and tariffs will mean suffering for people on both sides of the border. That, in fact, we should be working together, doing things together. And while he decides to ruin the Canadian economy, I don't know whether, in terms of negotiations or in the face of such bad faith, where he brings in tariffs against Canada without any factual justification, I don't know whether opening negotiations would be a good idea. We're open to doing it if he wants that, but he has not even referred to that possibility.
I'm just trying to remember. What was that? CUSMA, that's right. I think in terms of what he wants, and I heard he talked about banking again this morning in a tweet, which doesn't make any sense because American banks, there's about 16 American banks currently active in Canada holding about $113 billion worth of assets in this country. So the American banks are alive and well and prospering in Canada. It's an example of not really being able to see what it is that he wants, because even the excuse that he's giving for these tariffs today of fentanyl is completely bogus, completely unjustified, completely false. So we actually have to fold back on the one thing he has said repeatedly, that what he wants is to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy, because that'll make it easier to annex us, is the second half of his thought. Now, first of all, that's never going to happen. We will never be the 51st state. But yeah, he can do damage to the Canadian economy, and he's started this morning. But he is rapidly going to find out, as American families are going to find out, that that's going to hurt people on both sides of the border. Americans will lose jobs. Americans will be paying more for groceries, for gas, for cars, for homes, because we have always done best when we work together. So we are, of course, open to starting negotiations on the CUSMA review, but let us not fool ourselves about what he seems to be wanting. And I will admit, I have been holding out hope that these tariffs were just a clever negotiating ploy that would have the impact that they're having now without even bringing them in over the past weeks, as we've seen order books dry up for Canadian companies from American customers, as we've seen expansion plans in Canada put on hold, as we've seen people choosing to invest in the United States over the past weeks because of the threat of tariffs. But now that he's moved forward with tariffs, we're going to see the real impact of a trade war between our two countries. And that impact will be to hurt American families.
Prime Minister Tonda McCharles with the Toronto Star. I hope you can be as specific as possible for a number of these points. Everybody's looking to what actually you're going to do. In your statement last night, you referenced non-tariff measures, and I want to know exactly what you're prepared to contemplate there. And given that your likely successors, both Carney and Poilievre, have said it should be dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs, that's on $600 billion worth of American imports. If you were to do that, is that on or off the table?
I will be sitting down, as I have every week for the past many, many weeks, with the premiers this afternoon to talk about our individual, combined, and collective response to this. As we've put on the table, the federal government has $155 billion worth of tariffs that we can move forward with immediately, and that we will be moving forward with both now and 21 days from now to give Canadian companies time to adjust their supply chains to not be overly impacted by this. But there are many other things that have been surfaced by different premiers in different approaches that we can look at. One, for example, is around purchasing and around suppliers and around contracts, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal, with American companies. There are many different things that we've been looking at, and that conversation with the premiers this afternoon is going to be very, very important. But I can tell you what we have seen is Canadians across provinces and territories, across political lines, are united in knowing that this is a time to hit back hard and to demonstrate that a fight with Canada will have no winners. And the sooner we can get past this fight, back to working together to take on the world, as our two countries always have, the better we'll all be.
To what extent have you turned or gotten cooperation from any other allies to exact more pain on the U.S. to accelerate getting to a solution? And are you concerned that Mexico appears to be trying to do their own thing maybe next Sunday? Where are you with any guarantees you've got allies?
I've just spent quite a bit of time over these past couple of weeks meeting with European and international allies to talk about a number of different things, including standing up for the rules-based order by defending Ukraine, but also being there for each other in a more challenging and uncertain world. And I can tell you that every country is very, very aware that if the American government is willing to do this to their own closest ally, neighbor, and friend, everyone is vulnerable to a trade war. And our ability to work together thoughtfully and strategically to make sure we're supporting our citizens, we're doing things together in a more diversified way is something that is on the mind of all of our allies.
En français, vous en êtes où dans les discussions avec les alliés, que ce soit européens ou mexicains?
Where are you in discussions with European allies? Well, as you know, in recent weeks, I had a lot of conversations with many of our allies and our European friends on the international stage, and I can tell you that everyone is worried. They see that if the United States is prepared to do that to Canada, their closest ally and partner, their most interconnected ally, then everyone is at risk, and our ability to work together and to do more together to diversify our supply chains in a more deliberate manner. Well, these are the conversations we're having now, and we will continue to have them with our allies. With our Mexican partners, we continue to be in close contact, and we continue to look at how we can do things together, as I said, to not suffer any more than needed through these tariffs.
Rachel Haynes from CTV National News. As we know, the Liberal Party is going to be picking a new leader over the weekend, but when is it going to be your last official day as Prime Minister?
That will be up to a conversation between the new leader and myself to figure out how long a transition is needed. It should happen reasonably quickly, but there's a lot of things to do in a transition like this, particularly at this complicated time in the world. ma dernière journée sera
My
déterminée
last
une fois
day
que le
will be
nouveau
determined
chef
once
du Parti
the
libéral
new
sera choisi.
leader of the Liberal Party has
C'est
been
une
selected.
conversation
This is a
sur,
conversation
combien de temps
we will have to have
va être
about
nécessaire pour,
how much
la
time will
transition.
be required for the transition. There are a lot of things to be considered, but I know that we will be able to do that
So
quite quickly.
It sounds like it won't be immediately on March 9th or March 10th. So it sounds like you'll probably still have some time remaining to put in some more actions on this. Is one of those things that you're considering going to be taxing oil, gas, and potash exports, even if premiers don't consent to that?
As I said, the most important thing we're facing, as I've said, the most important thing we can do is ensure that Canadians remain united. That's why whatever response, individually or collectively, we do across the country, we have to make sure that no single part of the country is carrying a greater burden or suffering any more than everyone else. This is going to be tough for all of us, but we need to be pulling and holding Canadians together every step of the way. And that's the conversation I'm going to be having with the premiers this afternoon in our now weekly meetings. There will be many different ideas we discuss, but the most important thing, more important than doing specific or effective pressure points on the United States, is keeping Canadians united together. As we go through the pain that these American tariffs will inflict on our economy, on our workplaces, on Canadian families, we will be able to say this is happening to us by the decisions of a different government. As American families suffer the impact of these tariffs, of this trade war with Canada, they will be saying this is happening because our own government is choosing to do it to us. That's a very different proposition. And the most important thing right now, more important than anything else, is for Canadians to remain united. And that's why all premiers will be focused on things that make sure Canadians don't get divided amongst ourselves. This is a time for us to pull together, because the Americans will be having very real and very challenging debates and discussions about these actions. There will be no debate in Canada about whether or not we should be pulling together and responding. Everyone is aligned on that, and protecting that is job one for the Canadian government and the Canadian Prime Minister.
Hi, Mr. Trudeau.
Okay. Évidemment, il y a différentes choses que
Of course, there are a number of things that different provinces or industrial sectors may want to do to not feel so much pressure from the U.S. But I want to be very clear in saying that it's not because we don't want one sector or industry to carry a heavier burden than any other. And therefore, we have to be fair in our response and in the supports that we provide. Because the most important thing in all of this situation is that Canadians remain united. And that's what I intend to speak to the premiers of the provinces and territories about this afternoon.
Unity
with respect to our courage and determination as a country and as Canadians will be our most effective weapon in the coming days. Because Canadian families facing negative impacts as a result of these tariffs will be saying, well, we're going to stick together as Canadians because it's another country that's doing this to us. And we are going to stand firm and get through this together. American families that see job losses happening, that see prices going up because of these tariffs, they will have to say, well, yeah, it's because of our own government that we're suffering now. And that will lead to very tough conversations between Americans with respect to why this trade war is even happening.
We will take one last question and follow up. Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Trudeau. Mackenzie Gray with Global. You mentioned the markets earlier. Someone who knows a thing about them, Warren Buffett, came out and said that these tariffs could be viewed as an act of war. Does the Canadian government believe these tariffs from Donald Trump is an act of war from the U.S.?
Canadians are not angry at the American people for this. We don't have anything against Americans. Americans are our neighbors, our friends, our partners. We do things together. We've done things together for decades and generations. This is a policy decision by the American government designed to go after the Canadian economy. This is a trade war, yes. But Canadians are hurt. Canadians are angry. We're going to choose to not go on vacation in Florida or Old Orchard Beach or wherever. We're going to choose to try to buy Canadian products and forego bourbon and other classic American products. And yeah, we're probably going to keep booing the American anthem. But let me tell Americans, we're not booing you. We're not booing your teams. We're not booing your players. We're booing a policy that is designed to hurt us. And we're insulted. And we're angry. But we're Canadian, which means we're going to stand up for each other. We're going to fight. And we're going to win.
There are probably a lot of folks watching on TV today who've been laid off or they were told not to come into work today because of these tariffs. Can you explain to them why you've not announced any relief measures today to help those folks out?
As I've said, our entire focus has been on preventing these tariffs from coming in, if there was at all a way, and it now looks like there was never a way we were going to be able to avoid these tariffs that the President was determined to do. And our focus now is going to be on making sure that they get lifted and that there is an end to this trade war as quickly as possible. But over the past month, we have been working on measures that if these tariffs last longer than a few hours or a few days, we be able to help Canadian citizens, Canadian workers, Canadian companies make it through this time. But let's also be clear, this is going to be tough. The American trade war is going to hurt the Canadian economy and is going to hurt all of us. What our government needs to make sure we're doing is try to make sure that nobody goes hungry and that everyone carries their share of this. And that's a hard thing to do, but that's where we're leaning in, both as a federal government and with provinces and territories on responses to be there for Canadians.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister.
Merci.
That concludes today's press conference.
And that is the Prime Minister of Canada on this extraordinary day in Canada's history, with some extraordinary comments from him directly, things that we have frankly never heard him say before, speaking very frankly to both Canadians, Americans, and to the President, Donald Trump, saying that he agrees with the Wall Street Journal that this is a dumb idea. He also made it clear that he doesn't believe the President's motivation is about the border or fentanyl, says that he wants to damage or force a collapse of the Canadian economy in order to annex this country. He also, off the top of his comments, said that this is a day where the United States is now aligned with Russia a lying, murderous dictator, talking about Vladimir Putin, and not with Canada. An extraordinary moment for the Prime Minister in what is likely his final week in the job. I want to bring in all of our people helping us with our coverage. Janice McGregor in Ottawa, Katie Simpson and Peter Armstrong, both in Washington. An awful lot there to get into. So let's talk through some of it. I'm going to start with Janice, if that's okay. I don't know that I have ever, in my time covering the Prime Minister over more than a decade, heard him speak that forcefully and that bluntly about an ally, about a colleague in this extraordinary moment for the country, Janice.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally concur in that. Yeah. The language of diplomacy that, you know, when you're afraid of upsetting someone, that all out the window in terms of what we just heard. And an extraordinary kind of three-part structure to his actual prepared remarks. Some of the blunt language came in the questions later on as well. But if you look at sort of the way his message sort of spoke to the American people first, then had particularly targeted words at Donald Trump, and then talked to Canadians. We know the American networks were on him, at least for the initial parts, didn't maybe hang in for the whole thing like we did. But, you know, what they heard was a refutation of what they hear from their own White House. That kind of opening part where he talked about the changing relationship between the U.S. government and Russia, and plainly sort of looked into the camera and said, make that make sense. This idea that this fight is being picked with a neighbor like Canada while they are sort of, you know, looking the other way and warming things up with Russia. I thought that was an extraordinary moment right off the jump. And then sort of the economic message, taking that really hard to the American viewers, the ways that this is going to hurt them. And then, as you say, the very poignant remarks to Donald Trump, calling him by his first name, and not Mr. President. You know, trying to speak his language about how he wants to be seen as a smart guy, but this is dumb. And then the words of reassurance. And even that, like, this came up in the Q&A at the end, but sort of like putting a spin, a frame around the booing at the hockey game. You know, when Canadians boo, this is what they are doing, and this is what we mean by that. If any Americans still watching and you're wondering kind of what this means for people, interpreting that, in a way, I think would set a lot of Canadian heads nodding. All of it extraordinary. And we can tuck into some of the mechanics of some of the important legal kind of Easter eggs he buried at various points in these remarks, but just stunning set of messages here.
Yeah, and I'll bring in Katie now too for your perspective, Katie. He also, when he spoke to Canadians, was very plain in saying, "I don't want to sugarcoat it. This is going to be tough." And he talked about some of the things that the Canadian government can do to step up. But I want to ask you, Katie, about what you thought of his message to Americans, who was saying to them, if you want to know what's going on and why you're suffering, look at the government that you elected, and speaking directly to Donald Trump. What did you make of those comments?
Well, I've reached out to the White House to see if anyone in the Trump administration has any direct response to that, because we've never heard language like that from the Canadian Prime Minister directly at Donald Trump. Whatever their conversations might be in private, we certainly haven't heard anything like that in public. I keep checking Donald Trump's Truth Social to see if he has any sort of response there, and there's nothing yet. Rosemary, I'm told by a senior Canadian government source that at the Canadian Embassy, there are these banners that say friends, allies, and partners that have been put up all over sort of the pillars at the embassy, and that Donald Trump, as he makes his way to the Capitol and he drove past the Canadian Embassy, because it's right there, right across from the Capitol, that was something that he would have seen. I am told that those banners have been taken down as a result of what has taken place over the past 24, 48 hours. So there's just little things like that. But now we wait to see if the president is going to have any sort of response, if he was monitoring what was going on. Some American U.S. news networks, notably Fox News, did carry some of Donald Trump's or some of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's comments. But given how pointed the language came from the Prime Minister, I expect, and they're pointed short sound bites. And you know what plays well in American news? pointed, short sound bites. Yep. And so I very much suspect a lot of American network news, and we know that President Donald Trump consumes a lot of it, particularly his favorable news outlets, that they will be picking up this content and that it will make its way in front of the president. And the question is he going to respond? Is he going to acknowledge it? Donald Trump has a very big day, separate from everything that's going on with the trade war now, this trade war. He's going to be delivering a joint address to Congress where he's going to outline his vision for America. And part of what he campaigned on, of course, was trying to generate revenue for the United States through tariffs, imposing tariffs on allies and adversaries alike, taking this massive step in escalating the trade war. And so now, when Americans start to have to sort of live with the consequences of that, he's going to try to get ahead of that before the consequences, may be really felt the hardest, and trying to sell his vision to America. That is what he is going to be doing tonight. But one thing to keep in mind, there are some other really key issues in this moment that Americans are concerned about. First and foremost, some of the major changes underway at the American federal government, the firing particularly of veterans, the mass firings of the federal public servants, and the changes there that even some Republican lawmakers are getting a lot of grief about from their constituents in places that are reliably Republican red. So that is something that Donald Trump is expected possibly to address. He's done nothing but throw his support behind that. But how much the international backlash really sort of filters through to Trump's speech. We know he's a big fan of tariff. He's a believer in tariffs, and he's campaigned on it. So I would expect him to really champion what he's done. The question is, once Americans start to feel the pain, whether it's the Canadian response or the Mexican response or the response from China. Remember, China now has 20% tariffs on it as well. How much pain the White House is willing to endure in pursuit of Donald Trump's America First agenda.
Okay, Katie, thank you for that. I'm also going to bring in Peter Armstrong to talk a little bit more about what the Prime Minister said there. Again, some extraordinary comments, and clearly a Prime Minister who, seeing how the President berated President Zelensky in the Oval Office last Friday, got on a plane the next morning so that he could be in London for that special meeting of European leaders to show support for Ukraine. Obviously taking a clear approach in those comments as well, supporting Ukraine, but also coming hard after Russia and condemning the way President Trump is aligning himself with Russia. But over to you, Peter, on more of the business aspect of this. We heard a little bit about what he thinks businesses and Americans need to understand about what these tariffs are going to do.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's an interesting question as to whether Donald Trump has heard or seen any of these comments. We know as fact that he will have heard and seen what's happening on stock markets today, and he won't like what he's seeing. This is a fairly steep sell-off now, and it's gone through the better part of 24 hours now. So 680 points on the Dow down now. Add that to the 350 or so points that it fell yesterday, and you're starting to look at a fairly significant sell-off, and it makes sense, right? We know that tariffs drive up prices, they drive up unemployment, they eat into economic growth, and they cut into profits. And so that's the TSX, which is just getting clobbered. It's down like it's the better part of 2.25% right now. So it's tough, and it's been an interesting sort of stretch here that in the immediate wake of Donald Trump getting elected, in this wave of people being excited about deregulation and tax cuts and crypto enthusiasm and whatnot, just about everything was up. And there was this real wave of optimism in the business community and in markets and among investors. And they just simply didn't believe that this was actually going to happen. The Bloomberg columnist Joe Weisenthal says that Wall Street investors didn't take their own advice of you either have, take him seriously but not literally. They took him neither seriously nor literally, and that's how we got to this. So you're seeing this sort of pent-up reaction and a bit of frustration, I think, among investors who truly did not believe that this was any more of a tactic than Mexico's going to build the wall kind of thing. And now here we are in a real situation where markets and companies and earnings are really having to very quickly adjust to what this actually means for the American economy, not just the Canadian economy going forward.
Okay, Peter, I'm going to come back to you. Thank you for that, though. I appreciate your first take after hearing directly from the Prime Minister responding to those tariffs, saying that Canada has put in place $30 billion worth of 25% tariffs on American goods, going all the way up to $155 billion over the next number of weeks, but also speaking directly to the President and calling what he has done today dumb. I want to bring in Jason Kenney. He's a former Premier of Alberta. He's been watching all of this unfold as well. Nice to see you, Mr. Kenney.
Good to be here.
What do you make of where we are at today and the Canadian government's response?
Well, it is a bizarre moment. The way this is entirely unfolded, the delay a month ago was based on the president accepting actions and reassurances on his putative national security concerns about fentanyl migration. And that situation has only improved demonstrably with respect to Canada. I can't speak for Mexico, but it is particularly bizarre when we see this happening on the same day that apparently he is announcing a suspension of military support for Ukraine, including aerial defense, which means cruise missiles slamming into apartment buildings, hospitals, and schools, Iranian-made Shahed drones, and an announcement of a desire to get into full, close economic partnership with Russia. This is being done ostensibly on national security grounds, and yet Canada, the closest historic ally of the United States, is facing a larger tariff than the 10 plus 10, the 20% imposed on the People's Republic of China, which, according to Trump theorists, constitutes the largest national security threat to the United States. So, frankly, none of this makes sense unless you understand and take seriously the Trump trade doctrine. He sees this as a way of raising revenue for the U.S. Treasury and pummeling neighboring economies that are integrated through NAFTA. And we better be prepared for this for the long haul. The notion that this is just a one-off or that this is some short-term tactical negotiating leverage, I think would be a big error on our part.
So let's talk about, we got the retaliatory tariff list today. There'll be more on top of that. But one of the things that the Prime Minister said, Mr. Kenney, is that there will be other non-tariff measures to be considered. And you know what I'm going to ask you here, because Doug Ford this morning says he's slapping 25% tariffs on electricity to the states that Ontario serves. How much does this country have to prepare itself for putting export taxes on energy, on oil, on critical minerals, on the things that the United States needs from us?
Well, to be clear, if we were to do that, the tax goes on the Canadian producers, and there's only a limited extent to which we can pass that. Those producers can pass that on to the Americans. I, for one, believe that when you're dealing with these kinds of bully tactics, you have to have everything on the table and use calculated ambiguity. There is no doubt that President Trump, at one level at least, understands the critical role that Canadian oil imports play in the U.S. energy economy. After all, just a few days ago, he was once again renewing his call for a Keystone XL-style pipeline. Now, right now, 20% of U.S. oil imports come from Canada, primarily Alberta. 65% of U.S. imports come from Canada, but 20% of U.S. oil consumption is supplied by Canada. He was elected on a promise to cut gas prices in half. And yet today he's imposing a 10% tariff on the largest source of U.S. oil imports. None of this makes sense, which is why I think that we should be exercise, as I say, ambiguity about what the next steps might be. I don't think anything should be taken off the table or put on the table. All of our economic relations with the United States should be subject to review in this context of a trade war that he launched.
How immediately do you think your province, Alberta, and others will feel the impact of this? There are people, at home wondering if they'll have a job by the end of the week.
Yes, well, I would say that I think any really Canadian businesses that are particularly integrated and dependent on American orders will already have been feeling the impact of the uncertainty from the last several weeks. So I don't think there's a switch that's been flicked, which will have an immediate impact in the days to come. I'm much more concerned about the longer term uncertainty that this creates for new capital investment in Canada. Yeah. If you are in international business, I mean, I'm right here at the big global mining conference, PDAC in Toronto right now. And if you're a big global business looking at potentially investing billions of dollars in mining production, for example, in Canada, and you wonder how long are these tariffs going to be in place, should you go somewhere else? I don't know, like Russia, he's just put a 25% tariff on Canadian potash imports to the United States. 80% of U.S. fertilizer is dependent on Canadian potash, while at the same time his administration is talking about lifting sanctions on Russian and Belarusian potash. To privilege potash that would fund the Russian war machine? What kind of message does that send to markets? I'm much more concerned about those long-term signals that could be sent that could really impair investment in this country when we're already suffering from a lack of it.
Well, let me end on that, and that is the markets and the message that the Prime Minister had directly to Americans. Is that the only hope here, that the markets are tanking, that Americans start to feel the pinch, and that the President has to pull back?
I think so, and I assume that's what caused him to hit the pause button a month ago when Chuck Grassley, for example, the dean of the Republican Senate caucus, pointed out that this meant a huge spike in input costs for Midwestern farmers who overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump. There's one study suggesting that the 25% aluminum tariff could increase the price of an F-150, the most popular vehicle in the United States, by up to $8,000 US. That's a vehicle bought by MAGA voters. So I think when those things start to bite, input costs for ag, for gasoline, for vehicles, that I would hope that at least some cold-headed Republican senators will start to speak up for their constituents. And we all know that President Trump follows the stock market very closely, and presumably he's going to see the impact that this has on markets generally and his voters in particular.
Jason Kenney, former Premier of Alberta, thank you for jumping on so quickly. I'll let you get back to your mining conference. Thank you, sir. Nice to see you. I'm going to take you live now to Toronto, where Ontario Premier Doug Ford is speaking. Let's listen.
They will also hurt Americans. U.S. markets are on the decline. In fact, the S&P 500 has already wiped out over $3 trillion in value. Factory floors and assembly lines across the American Rust Belt will start to close. American workers will be out of a job. American families will be poorer. This is not the outcome anyone wanted. Over the past few months, we've taken a strong, united Team Canada approach. The federal government, provinces and territories, municipalities, unions, business leaders who have all made the case. We're so much stronger together. I've spoken to governors, senators, congressmen and women from every region, both Democrats and Republicans. They know, they tell me, these tariffs are a massive mistake. We could have stayed focused. We could have poured our effort into making Canada, the U.S., the two richest, most successful, safest, most secure two countries on the planet. Unfortunately, one man, President Trump, has chosen chaos instead. Now, we have no choice. We have to respond. Earlier this morning, Prime Minister Trudeau and his team announced retaliatory tariffs. They have my full support for a strong and forceful response. Tariff for tariff, dollar for dollar. As they do, the federal government needs to ensure it's getting revenues from its tariffs to impacted workers and businesses as soon as possible. To support the federal government's efforts, Ontario will also launch its first round of retaliation. Starting today, LCBO, the largest purchaser of alcohol in the world, will begin removing U.S. products from its store shelves. And as the exclusive wholesaler, American brands will no longer be available in LCBO catalog, meaning other retailers, bars, and restaurants in the province will no longer be able to restock U.S. products. This is an enormous hit to the American producers. Every year, the LCBO sells nearly $1 billion worth of U.S. wine, beer, cider, seltzers, and spirits, including more than 3,600 products from 35 states. As of today, every single one of these products is off the shelves. Also, starting today, all U.S.-based companies will be banned from taking part in government procurement. Every year, the province and its agencies spend about $30 billion on procurement, alongside our more than $200 billion planned to build infrastructure. U.S.-based businesses will now lose out on tens of billions of dollars in revenues. They only have President Trump to blame. I'm also urging all 444 municipalities to do the same, and I'm thrilled to see some are already stepping up. For example, Mayor Patrick Brown in the city of Brampton and many other cities. As part of this government-wide procurement ban, we're going one step further. We're ripping up Ontario's contract with Starlink. It's done, it's gone. We won't award contracts to people who enable and encourage economic attacks on our province and our country. Alongside federal tariffs and the measures my fellow premiers are bringing forward, this Team Canada's opening response. We also need to be ready to dig in for a long fight. We need to be ready to escalate using every tool in our toolkit. That includes surcharges or even outright restrictions on the critical minerals and electricity we supply to the United States. The critical minerals and electricity they depend on. Today, I'm writing to every senator, every congressman and woman, and the governors from New York State, Michigan, and Minnesota, telling them that these tariffs persist. If the Trump administration follows through on any more tariffs, we will immediately apply a 25% surcharge on the electricity we export. We will not hesitate to shut off their power as well. I'm encouraging my fellow premiers to follow suit. Friends, I know you're worried. You're concerned about the future. I want you to know I will fight like I've never fought before. I will do whatever it takes to protect you, your families, and your communities. We are watching the real-world impacts of these tariffs, and we will be there for you. We will spare no expense to protect Ontario workers. We'll retrain impacted workers for new jobs. We'll retool companies for new customers and new markets. We'll reshore supply chains to bring good jobs back home. And we'll rebuild roads, highways, bridges to keep people working. Led by my friend Premier Tim Houston, we're breaking down costly internal trade barriers. And we need to cut the red tape to end the delays that are blocking projects with enormous economic potential like the Ring of Fire. Canada and Ontario did not start this fight. We want to work with our American friends and allies, not against them. We said we'd never start a trade and tariff war with the U.S., but you better believe we're ready to win one. Friends, I've always been straight up with you. The coming days and weeks will be hard. Businesses and families will feel the pain of this needless fight. But together, we're going to stand up for Canada. We're going to get through this more united than ever before. Together, we're going to protect the true north strong and free. Thank you, and may God bless the people of Ontario.
We will now take questions from the media. Please come to the mic and state your name and outlet. Just a reminder, it's one question and one follow-up. First question.
Yes, I agree with the Prime Minister. That's what President Trump wants, to dismantle, close down plants, take food off our table. But I can tell the Canadian population and the Ontario population, we'll fight like we've never fought before. The difference is the federal government, we have the lowest debt in the all G7. And Americans, the U.S., have one of the highest debts. And talking to the American people and all the elected officials, no one is agreeing. When Warren Buffett comes out and says this is basically, he's saying it's a disaster, along with every other CEO down in the U.S., this will affect Americans. It will hurt Canadians, but it's going to hurt Americans. The assembly lines in the auto sector will shut down within 10 days, I predict. Hopefully they won't, but I'm predicting they'll shut down because of the trade that we do back and forth, the supply chain. That parts, as you've heard many times, goes back and forth up to 8 times, each time hitting a 25% tariff on both sides of the border. I am almost positive the assembly plants will shut down on both sides of the border.
Premier Mark McAllister from City News.
Hi, Mark.
You've recognized the fact that this is going to hurt on this side of the border as well. The Prime Minister said that his priority first is to try and keep these tariffs from lasting any longer than they need to, not necessarily managing what can be done to help Canadians and deal with their loss. I'm just wondering what you can do right away to help people in terms of resources, perhaps cash.
I'll be sitting down with Prime Minister Trudeau this afternoon, along with the premiers. We do have a plan, so no different than the pandemic, very similar. We'll be supporting the people, we'll be supporting companies, and we're making sure that we diversify our trade, bring in more opportunities from around the world. Folks, we have 51 countries that we have tariff-free agreements with. We need to unite with them. We've brought over $70 billion of business from around the world to Ontario, but we need to continue. What we have to blame, we need to look in the mirror. Over the last decades, we've taken the U.S. for granted as our #1 trading partner. We need to speed up approvals on critical minerals that the world wants, the Americans need, and we have. We can no longer take 10 years to get shovels in the ground. This is what we need to do on many areas. We need to move quickly. We need to move quickly on infrastructure projects across Ontario. The federal government, they need to move quickly on making sure that when they go out for procurement, they're Canadian companies. They have to speed up the procurement. One example is the 400 light armored vehicles in London with General Dynamics. We can't hold on to these purchasing agreements. We need to move them forward to give people certainty. We need to start building roads and highways and bridges. We need to start building rail right across the country. We need to build a pipeline east, west, and north. We should have done this decades ago. Again, we need to move quickly on this because this isn't the end of Donald Trump. We're going to be dealing with Donald Trump for another 4 years of unpredictability, threats to all or their neighbors, but right around the world. So we have to make sure we diversify and make sure that the provinces, municipalities, and the federal government buy Ontario, and secondly, buy Canadian if we can't make it here in Ontario. And again, I mentioned it the other day to the retailers. Across Canada, we buy $800 billion worth of retail products, no matter if it's grocery or tools or other things. We have to make sure we onshore these products. And if the big 5 retailers or 6 retailers in the groceries, you can't find it anywhere else, we will make it here in Ontario or other places around the country. We need on the shelf talkers. I love, by the way, the apps that are coming out. But little Ms. Jones that are walking down the aisle, she's not using that app to scan every single bag and every single product. They need to put it very clearly on their shelves. And I'm asking for their support. And if they don't do it, I will legislate it. You put your price, you put the Canadian flag beside the price. And the other ones, I need every product from the U.S. to have the price in an American flag. You don't have to worry about any other products if they're coming from around the world. We aren't battling against the rest of the world. The battle is against President Trump. And I always emphasize, folks, I talk to endless Americans. I talk to endless elected officials. It is not them. Don't blame the American people. It's Donald Trump to be blamed for this.
Second question to follow up on that. You said an immediate surcharge on electricity being exported, 25%, but you said you will not hesitate to shut off power as well. At what point does that happen?
Well, this is going to be a long battle, and we have to keep our ammunition dry for the next round. As the Commerce Secretary came out and President Trump has said, another round is going to hit us on April the 2nd, and I'm highly recommending to President Trump, don't force our hand. You underestimate Canadians, you're making a massive mistake. We're resilient, we're proud, and we're strong, and we will survive, and we will continue to thrive. We'll get through this together.
Richard Southern, 680 News Radio. Premier, no doubt many Ontarians are happy to hear that you're ripping up the contract with Starlink, but can you tell them today what the break fee is? How many of their tax dollars are still going to Starlink as part of the break fee?
Well, I'll be getting that information, but it's principle, Richard. This is principle. To cancel Starlinks to President Trump's right-hand man, Elon Musk. And isn't it ironic that he got educated, part of his education was at Queen's, and he's attacking the country and the province that gave him the opportunity to go to Queen's University? They should be embarrassed that he went to Queen's. He should be embarrassed to attack the people that took care of him for a number of years with his family.
Premier, will the LCBO be selling the American alcohol it has already purchased? And if not, is there a financial cost attached to that for Ontarians?
We're going to store it for what we have right now, and we'll wait until the tariffs come off the table. And then, depending on where we're at, we'll restock the shelves. But in the last a few days, we've been sending a letter down to the governors and all the suppliers of the states saying that these tariffs continue, they're coming off. And as I always use the bourbon as an example, but there's many. But the governor of Kentucky said, don't touch our bourbon. And I said, Governor, that's the first thing we're going after. We're going after their bourbon. I can tell you the people in Kentucky, they're great people. Do anything, but don't touch the bourbon. Well, we're the largest purchaser of bourbon in the world for Kentucky bourbon manufacturers. They're done, they're gone. And I want to thank Senator Mitch McConnell that stood up, one of the few senators, and the other senator slipped my mind from Wisconsin, that actually stood up against Donald Trump. I encourage other congresspeople, other senators, other governors to stand up to Donald Trump. He's two votes short in Congress. If he loses 2 votes, he'll be short of getting his tax breaks. So the congresspeople in the red states, you need to speak up for your people, because your factories are going to be empty, they're going to be shut down, there's going to be unemployment, inflation's going to hit, and it's going to hurt the American people. You need to speak up against Donald Trump and speak up for your people. That's what we do here in Canada.
Hey, Premier Barbara with QP Briefing. So when you called the election, you said you needed Ontarians' approval to pass your economic support package to protect the economy. But now that the tariffs really hit us, you can't get this done until mid-March when the legislature is back. So I'm just wondering, do you regret calling this election now?
No, that's totally inaccurate, first of all. I'm going to set the record straight. We can do anything right now without going back in the legislature. And secondly, Elections Ontario Act cannot swear in MPPs till March the 17th. Our cabinet is active right now, and we can do whatever we need to do to protect the people of Ontario.
So the other question I have, the Prime Minister said he thinks that the tariffs are not about fentanyl, and that's just the legal justification behind what Trump is doing. So I'm wondering, what do you think the tariffs are about?
Well, number one, I believe in strengthening our border. I've believed in that for the last 7, 8 years. But was it a smokescreen? Absolutely, it was a smokescreen. Did we listen to President Trump about tightening up our border? We absolutely did. We've spent over, I think it was $1.5 billion, somewhere around that range with the federal government. We have Operation Deterrence with our OPP, and I want to thank our OPP. I want to thank Commissioner Creek for putting a great team of 200 officers together to patrol the borders, making sure that we have the drones, we have the helicopters, we have water vehicles, we have ATVs, boots on the ground. And I just want to thank the incredible job all our police services across our great province and our great country. will always have their backs.
Hello, Premier. Stephanie Hughes, Bloomberg. As far as your jurisdiction goes, how will you actually implement cutting off or putting outright restrictions on critical minerals and electricity into the U.S.? What does that process look like?
Well, the federal government is in charge of any export. So we will be working with the federal government regarding, I use our high-grade nickel, that the U.S., 50% of what they use down there comes from Ontario. If we have to stockpile it, if we have to ship it around the world, that's what we'll do. But I'll be sitting down talking with the Prime Minister this afternoon on the process of going through that.
Follow-up question. Canada's biggest points of leverage with the U.S. are oil, uranium, and potash. What do you have to say about the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan who might be expressing reluctance to put taxes on their products there?
Well, I have absolutely no jurisdiction in Saskatchewan. I consider Scott Moe a good friend of mine. I've served with him longer than any other premier, and I've talked to him. We need to make sure America feels the pain. You know, Donald Trump wants to go after our dairy farmers. Without potash down there, they don't have a farming system. And when it comes to uranium, they're using that to enrich their uranium down in the U.S. for their nuclear energy. Again, I do not speak for Saskatchewan or on behalf of Premier Moe, but I will encourage him to ship uranium anywhere. Everyone wants wants his uranium. Ship it out other places, because the only other place they can get uranium is in Russia. And I see President Trump cozying up to Putin. What a disaster that is. He attacks his closest friends and neighbors, stood shoulder to shoulder with them in wars and other crises. And who does he cozy up to? But Putin. You got to be kidding me. You know something? The American people don't agree with him, and he will pay the price in the midterms.
Premier Jeff Gray, Globe and Mail. Just wanted to clarify on the energy surtax idea. Your energy minister told me yesterday that this requires enabling legislation, so you will need the legislature, and that's at least a couple of weeks away, a few weeks away. So can you clarify the timing on when you could actually impose such a charge on U.S. electricity?
Well, we are looking into it. We've asked Secretary D'Emanuel to come up with a system, anything that we can move quicker on this. Maybe we can regulate it, something. Because I don't always accept we can't. Matter of fact, I hate the word we can't. We can come up with a solution and come up with it immediately, because we need to act immediately.
And I wanted to ask, just following up on something you said yesterday about the $70 billion in investment that your government has secured from companies around the world, Stellantis, Volkswagen, the subsidies and so on. Have you had any conversations with those companies about the current status of those investments, which must be, you mentioned they're worried, they must be extremely worried and tentative now?
It's the word uncertainty, and thank you for that question. It's uncertainty. I know Minister Vic Fedeli is working hand in hand with them. I've talked to some part suppliers, and I'll be reaching out to the six major auto manufacturers here in Ontario. It's not just going to hurt the auto workers here. It goes hand in hand because of the supply chain. The supply chain in the auto pack has been around since the 1960s. And as I've said, and you know, with the auto pack, you can't unscramble an egg. You have to make the omelet larger.
Hi, Premier. Alison Jones with the Canadian Press. I just wanted to try and clarify again on the timing of your electricity measures. For the surcharge and for potentially shutting off the supply, are you waiting on both of those scores until more tariffs come in? Are both of those moves contingent on if they implement more tariffs?
We want to do the first part, a 25% surcharge. We have contacted the governors, senators, congresspeople. The letters are going out this afternoon to tell them that's exactly what we're going to do. And if they go further into April, then we'll cut off their electricity. You know, I feel terrible because they're great governors. I know all three of them. I've worked well with them. You know, I've met them all. We've had them to Ontario. They're great people. And I have to apologize to the governors and the American people. You need to make sure you send a message to President Trump. This is hurting Americans. This is hurting his red states. And isn't it amazing he had a mandate to lower cost, lower inflation, create more jobs, and it's working against them. People are going to be losing their jobs. There isn't going to be new jobs. Inflation's going through the roof. And as I told my American friends on the networks, and I changed it from the Canadian to the American, but the stock market, I predicted the other day, will go downhill quicker than the American bobsled team. And what's happening? Over $3 trillion. And it's just tanking right now. That says everything. When the market drops, that's the people speaking. That's investors around the world speaking. That's pension funds speaking. And all the CEOs down in the U.S. of the largest corporations in the world. I heard Walmart made a statement, Target's made a statement, many others are saying this is going to be a disaster. Prices are going to go up in the next few days. And isn't this a shame that the two greatest friends, greatest allies in the world, that one man, President Trump, decides to turn their whole country and our country and Mexico into absolute chaos right now. He needs to pay the price in the midterms. If I got to go down there and knock on the doors myself, I will.
And you're banning American companies from future procurement, ripping up the Starlink deal. Are there any other contracts you would be considering terminating, or is that off the table?
I've asked the Ontario Public Service, the deputy ministers and our ministers to go through with a fine-tooth comb and anything, no matter if it's services through the tech sector or any other products, we need to stop immediately. And if they come at us, sue us, so be it. We're standing up for Ontario, we're standing up for Canada, and we're willing to fight in court. This is about principle, making sure that we send a message to Donald Trump, and unfortunately, the American people are going to pay for his actions because they elected him in, and they're going to pay the price. And I want to inflict as much pain as we possibly can until we get to a deal of the USMCA. He says that we can't withstand this. Well, he's going to find out what we can and can't withstand. Sure, it's going to be tough. It's going to be very tough. But I've never seen patriotism like I've seen running wild across the country. When I go into the grocery store and I see people turning the bag around to read where it was made, they shouldn't have to do that. The retailers need to act, and I'll be calling all the retailers, the CEOs, to act immediately on the shelf talkers. You should be able to walk down the aisle and see if it's Canadian or American instantly. And I know, I understand there's some things you might just have to buy, right, out of the U.S. But for the most part, even if we switch our buying power just a little bit, as much as we possibly can, that the Canadian people are doing, I'm seeing it here in Ontario, that's going to put pressure on the U.S. And it's going to put pressure on companies like Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Nestle. Those are some of the big companies that ship in a ton of products here. So the CEOs of those three companies and many others, you need to get a message, you need to get your lobbyists, you need to do something and call President Trump and call him out for how he's going to lose jobs in the U.S. because of his reckless decisions.
Hi, Premier. Lorenda Redekop with CBC News. You talked about the auto industry and that those plants on both sides of the border could close within 10 days. I've heard even shorter than that from other people. Yes. Is there another industry that you are most concerned about that where there could immediately be those types of closures?
I am manufacturing. Manufacturing of all goods. We're an economic powerhouse in North America. We can manufacture anything and everything here because of the skills of the people here in Ontario. So I'm very concerned about that as well.
You've talked about Buy Canadian. We're seeing that from a lot of Ontarians right now. We're also hearing them talk about not wanting to travel to the U.S. I know you have some pretty deep connections south of the border. I don't know for you personally if this will affect your travel.
You know, something that I can't dictate. Like if some family goes down to California or Arizona or Florida, that, I can't control that. And I would say carry on. But the biggest impact that we could have is right here in Canada, right here in Ontario. Stop buying U.S. goods.
I just wanted to clarify. I was talking about your travel, not family.
Oh, my travel. If I got to go down on business, I'll go down on business. If I have to go to Washington, I'll go to Washington. If I have to go down and visit governors, I'll go down and visit governors. You know, again, I can't tell people to restrict their travel. A lot of people. I'll give you an example because this is a good question. 3.2 million Canadians go to Florida every single year. They own $30 billion, with a B, $1 billion worth of real estate. They pay $1 billion of taxes, and they spend approximately $10 billion. And guess what Governor DeSantis says? Well, they'll still come down. And I'm sure they will. But what an attitude. You know, what an attitude. You should be grateful 3.2 million Canadians come down there. And again, I'm not blaming the people, the residents of Florida. They're great people. I'm not telling people don't travel or anything. But when you're in Canada, do your very best, very, very best to buy Canadian products. And as well, on my next press conference, I'll come out with all the cars that we manufacture right here in Ontario, through Toyota, through Honda, through General Motors. I know Stellantis is retooling, as well as Ford. And Volkswagen, we want to continue moving forward, building the largest battery facility in North America.
Hey, good afternoon, Premier Colin DeMello from Global News. During the election, you had mentioned, or you had proposed something in the neighborhood of $18 billion in terms of economic supports.
Yes.
Can you actually deliver those economic supports without the legislature first voting on it?
Yes, we can. Yeah, I confirm that, Colin. We can move forward and get that done. We're going to be there. I'll spare no expense, just similar to the pandemic. I'm going to support the people. I have the confidence in the people of Ontario. We will bounce back stronger and more united than ever. We've learned lessons here. We've learned lessons that we shouldn't be taking 10 years when there's hundreds of billions, if not $1 trillion worth of critical minerals the world want, and we're hitting barrier after barrier, no matter if it's a federal government or other areas. The federal government, when it comes to critical minerals and the Constitution, it falls under the provinces and the territories. Please get out of our way. We need to get shovels in the ground. We need to get these minerals back up and shipped out right across the world and across Ontario.
So can we then talk about the speed at which you're going to deploy those resources? Because part of that was a $5 billion Protect Ontario fund that businesses could draw from. At what point will that fund be available?
We're going to have a discussion today, and thank you for that, Colin. We're going to have a discussion today with the Prime Minister and the other premiers and see what sectors are getting hit the hardest. But I encourage the federal government, all the tariff money needs to go back to the people and the businesses immediately, as quickly as they can, to support these businesses and support the people, and we're there.
Good afternoon, Premier. It's Rob Ferguson, Toronto Star. Just wondering, do you have any other premiers on your side on either export taxing on electricity or other energy, or cutting off altogether? I think maybe Quebec, but I'm not sure.
I've had many conversations. I had one with Premier Legault. I don't want to make it a habit of speaking on behalf of other provinces. Premier Houston is in the next room. He'll be coming out right after I'm done here. You can ask them. You can also get your affiliates across the country to ask them. But I'll be a strong voice as the chair of the Federation this year on our call with the premiers and with the Prime Minister, encouraging all the premiers, no matter if it's BC shipping electricity, Manitoba shipping electricity, Quebec shipping electricity, Ontario shipping electricity, and I'm sure New Brunswick and some other East Coast provinces ship electricity. I can't force anyone. That's going to be up to them. I will encourage them. We have to work as Team Canada across the board. And we have incredible premiers, by the way. I'm blessed to be the chair of the Federation with incredible 12 other premiers, including myself, be 13 other premiers across the province. We have a strong, strong team, and we work so well together.
Okay, that is the Ontario Premier Doug Ford responding to the news today that 25% tariffs have been put in place on Canadian exports by Donald Trump, 10% on Canadian energy. He is retaliating as a province, pulling all liquor and alcohol off the shelves of the LCBO in Ontario. That is significant because it is the largest purchaser of alcohol in the world. Kentucky in particular, very concerned about this, given the amount of bourbon that they produce. I spoke to the governor of Kentucky a few weeks back, and he was very concerned for how this would affect his state. Several other measures that he's putting in place as well. You see there also on the side of your screen, Pierre Poilievre is responding. We'll bring that to you in its entirety in just a moment. But Andrew Furey is the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, and he's been patiently waiting. So I want to get to you, Mr. Furey. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. How are you?
I'm good. So what do you make of where we are today? This has happened now. We had the pause and now it's in place, and the federal government has responded with $30 billion in counter tariffs and an additional 125 in a few weeks' time. Do you believe that that is the right response, Premier?
I do. I think it's time for Canadians to see this as what it is, for what it is. It's an attack on our economy, but it's conflating the issue of our sovereignty as well. So when we're formulating a response and a strategy, we have to be very measured, very balanced, very proportional, which I think the federal government has been, but not to lose sight in the pursuit of an acute solution what I believe to be the president's real agenda, which is an imperialistic, expansive one, that we stand firm and have the courage and the resolve to stand up for our Canadian values and who we are as Canadians and our independence. So the president has always conflated issues. From the very beginning, I said this fentanyl business, while it's important that we take fentanyl off the streets, was a red herring. It was conflation to cause confusion that would lead to exactly what he's done today, to rationalize putting in the tariffs. But make no mistake, Rosie, this isn't a direct attack on Canadians, on the country of Canada, not just the economy of Canada, but the country of Canada.
And Premier, what are you going to be doing in your province specifically to counter these measures? What kind of measures are you going to take?
Sure. So we fully support the federal government's proportional response. I think it's balanced. I think it's measured. From Newfoundland and Labrador's perspective, we'll continue to meet the moment by doing items and instruments that, for example, Premier Ford just talked about, and removing American liquor from the shelves of our liquor corporation. We'll also be looking at removing procurement barriers for Canadian companies and removing Americans from the procurement process if and when possible. In addition to that, we need to use the muscle memory, the institutional knowledge that we had from COVID to ensure that the policy instruments are in place, both from a subnational and national level, to support workers in industries, not just in the ones that are immediately impacted, but the adjacent industries as well.
You heard Premier Ford there. He is determined, he says, to use energy, electricity in particular, as leverage against the handful of states that Ontario serves. He is going to implement a 25% surcharge. He says he feels badly about it, but he feels it is important to do. And if it comes down to it, he's also willing to just shut it down entirely. What did you make of that? And are you also prepared to take those measures when it comes to energy?
Look, I think we need to meet the moment with the correct response. I think it's time to be calm and collected and balanced in our response. Escalation is not necessarily going to win the day here. That's not to say that we can't be firm in the response. I can't wait to speak with Premier Ford and the Prime Minister in a couple of hours from now on the First Minister's call. I think energy, as you heard me say from day one, if we're playing a game of chess, it's the queen, and we can't take the queen out too early. So I'm interested to hear Premier Ford's rationale behind. There's an extreme difference between export tariffs and exclusion altogether, and I'm interested to hear the strategy and thinking behind this. But I worry sometimes that threats of exclusion could cause escalation, and we need to just make sure we have the careful balance here. But my message on this First Minister's call is going to be that while there is the pursuit of the acute economic and fiscal issues, which are real, we can't lose sight of protecting who we are.
Last question to you. I believe the last time we talked about this very issue, Premier, we did talk about the industries that would be hit hardest
in the immediate, in the short term, and I believe it was the crab industry. But what do you think you are going to see in your province over the course of the next number of days? Who will be directly impacted quickly by this?
Certainly, the fishery is most important right now because they're at a critical time where they set the price for the fishery, and I guess in some respects this creates some certainty in that we know that the 25% is going to be there, so it'll allow both sides to come together to set a price. The issue is if the price is worth fishing for, of course. So that is going to be the industry that's immediately impacted, but we're going to work with harvesters to support them, with adjacent industries, including fish plant workers, truckers, to support them. But we also need to use this moment of disruption immediately to diversify our markets. And that's why our ministers are spread across the world in order to make them aware of the great product that we have in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that we can get it to them because we have access to title. One of our disadvantages in the past when it comes to manufacturing has been that we are an island or a northern portion of Canada in the middle of the North Atlantic. Now that can be perceived as an advantage because we can ship our energy, we can ship our critical minerals, and we can ship our fish anywhere to the world.
Okay, Premier, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for jumping on and making the time. I know you'll get on that Premier's call and hopefully have a good conversation. Appreciate your time today, sir.
Thanks very much.
That's Premier Andrew Furey, the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, reminding you that Pierre Poilievre was just up in the foyer of the House of Commons. Let's listen to his comments now.
At 12:01 a.m., President Trump stabbed America's best friend in the back. My message to the President is this: Canada will fight back. We will defend our people and our economy, and we will put Canada first. There is no doubt that our economy will suffer, but so will yours, President Trump. In fact, you're already paying the price, with trillions of dollars erased in stock market value over the last month of these threats. Already, Americans are paying higher gas prices, as at midnight, a new American gas tax kicked in on U.S. working-class taxpayers and motorists. Your workers will soon start losing jobs they had upgrading Canadian raw materials, which, by the way, you were getting at an incredible and ridiculous bargain. And your businesses will be selling fewer products to your closest neighbor. And that's only the beginning. While Canadians are slow to anger and quick to forgive, once provoked, we fight back. And we will fight back. Now, I'd like to speak to the millions of Canadians who are anxious today after learning that President Trump has attacked our economy, to the auto workers, the forestry workers, the steel and aluminum workers, the mining and energy workers, the truckers, the farmers, to all of you who get out of bed before the sun rises and do the labor of the nation. You are afraid right now, and I understand. I want you to know that I will fight for you. I will fight for your job. I will fight for your family. I will fight for your chance at owning and paying off a home, and I will fight for your retirement. And I will fight to put Canada first. Before these tariffs came in this morning, you must have been asking yourself, how could things get any worse? Before these tariffs, you were already suffering. You wondered how you'd pay the rent, or eventually dream of buying a home after housing costs had doubled over the last decade, rising faster than in any other G7 country. You've downgraded your diet, as food prices have risen 37% faster in Canada than in the United States over the last 5 years. You might be one of the 2 million people, a record-breaking number, lined up at food banks, a number that has more than doubled before these tariffs applied. You've likely noticed that your paycheck is not keeping up with the record inflation, as Canada's GDP has grown less and lower than any other G7 country over the last decade. You might have noticed that your company has already been moving jobs to the United States, as greedy and self-serving CEOs put their share prices ahead of your job, and $500 billion net has left from Canada to Trump's America under the current Liberal government. And now this. But I'm here with a message of hope. We will overcome this attack on our economy. and I have a plan to do it. First, we must retaliate, targeting American goods in the following order. A, goods that we can make ourselves. B, goods we don't need. And C, goods we can get from elsewhere. Second, counter tariffs must not be a cash cow for the government. Almost every penny of the tariffs collected should go to tax cuts, with a small sum set aside for targeted relief to workers hardest hit by the trade war. None of the money should go to new government spending and programs. We must not allow politicians to dishonestly use this crisis to once again launch a debt-fueled, money-printing spending spree that will drive up inflation and further destroy the working class and hit the poorest people the hardest. Third, we must immediately pass a bring-it-home tax cut on work, investment, energy, and home building. The idea is to neutralize the cost of the tariffs with lower taxes and incentivize massive new investment in building stuff here in this country. The obvious place to start is to get rid of the Liberal carbon tax, then axe the sales tax on new homes. We need to reverse the Liberal capital gains tax hike and slash income tax so that hard work pays off and you bring home more of each dollar you earn. Fourth, we must immediately repeal the Liberal No New Pipelines Law C-69, a law that not only blocks all pipelines but stops mines, refineries, export plants, and all kinds of other energy infrastructure and makes us hopelessly reliant on one customer, the Americans, a customer we cannot count on anymore. We must greenlight LNG plants that Liberals say there is no business case for, so that we can no longer have to sell our 100% of our LNG, our gas exports to the Americans. We can sell it to Asia and Europe and help break the European dependence on Putin, turning dollars for dictators into paychecks for our people. 5, you know what industry Donald Trump does not control in Canada? Home building. It is a homegrown industry. We must get rid of all taxes and red tape to unleash the biggest home building boom this country has ever seen, bigger than the post-war boom when our heroes were coming back from that war. We need to build homes faster than ever, and that means removing the bureaucracy, the red tape, the taxes, and the gatekeepers, and I will make it happen. That will also boost the demand for softwood lumber. The loggers are suffering after Biden hit them with tariffs already. And 6, let's get our provinces together to knock down trade barriers so that we can lower prices and boost wages for our people. 7, we must secure our borders and rebuild our military to assert our sovereignty and strength in the world. All these things, axing taxes, building homes, unleashing construction of our resources, fixing the budget, stopping crime, all of these things were conservative fixations before the tariffs. Now they are even more necessary. But none of these things have happened in the last 100 days since Trump first launched his tariff threats. Look behind me. Parliament has been closed. Liberals shut it down to focus on their political battles. So the job-killing carbon tax is still in place. The sales tax is still in place on new homes. The No New Pipelines Law still in place. The massive inflationary deficits still in place. Not one law has been changed. Not one tax has been cut. Not one action has been taken to free us from the grip of Trump and the U.S. We need change, and we will get change. It will be tough. Building Canada was tough, and so are Canadians. We will bring home the country we know and love and restore its promise. Canada will be self-reliant, sovereign, and stand on its own 2 feet. We will build on the great legacy and vision of John A. Macdonald of uniting our country east to west. We'll reward work, unleash entrepreneurs, harvest resources, make our own goods, trade with each other, build homes for our youth, rebuild our borders and military, honor our history, and raise our flag. What binds us together is the Canadian promise that anyone from anywhere can achieve anything, that hard work gets you a great life in a beautiful house on a safe street, protected by solid borders and brave troops under a proud flag. To preserve that flag and its promise, we must work together, fight together, and win together. That is what it means to put Canada first, because Canada is worth fighting for our people, for our land, for our home, for our country. Let's bring it home.
Do you agree with the tariffs? What do you think Donald Trump wants by imposing these tariffs? What do you think Donald Trump wants by imposing these
Est-ce qu'on devrait mettre en place des programmes d'aide pour aider les Canadiens? Et plus généralement, lorsque le gouvernement fédéral met en place des programmes d'aide, doit-il dépenser de l'argent?
The government has to bring in relief programs. That means spending money. Well, will be targeted so that we're going to directly meet the needs of Canadians as a result of this trade war. But we should not be using this crisis in order to create other programs not associated with the trade war. As we saw during the pandemic, the government brought in a lot of other programs during COVID-19 that were not associated with the pandemic. So we have to put support in place and have it targeted to those people who are directly affected. Employment insurance has to be there to help people to pay for their groceries and other costs, but at the same time, the vast majority of the money raised through the tariffs should be used to cut taxes in order to boost our economy. Now, the executive order that we see today is associated with fentanyl. Do you think the government did enough on that? And do you believe President Trump's argument that it was because of fentanyl that this order came about? The answer is no and no. It's true that the Liberals did not do enough to protect Canadians from fentanyl. I said that 2 or 3 years ago, well before Mr. Trump regained power. But that is not a justification. He has no justification for introducing tariffs against Canada. There is no possible justification. There are guns and fentanyl and illegal immigrants that coming from the United States into Canada. Is that his fault? That's not an excuse. Yes, we have to tackle fentanyl, but not to please Donald Trump. It's to ensure that no mayor receives a knock on the door to be told that his son has died from fentanyl. We have to bring in life sentences for drug sellers. We have to add another 2,000 border agents. We have to have scanners and surveillance equipment at the border. We absolutely must stop fentanyl coming into this country, not for Mr. Trump, but for Canadians.
Sorry, I didn't get a chance to say that in English. The question was, have the Liberals done enough on fentanyl, and is that a good justification for Trump's tariffs? And the answer to both questions is no and no. No, the Liberals have not done enough on fentanyl, but not because they should have been doing it for Trump. They should have been doing it for Canadians. We've lost 50,000 people to fentanyl. That's more than died in the Second World War. And that is because of the weak borders, the soft laws, and the radical liberalization of drugs that the Liberals experimented with and that they want to continue on with. I would ban the drugs, add 2,000 CBSA border guards, more surveillance towers, scanners, and drones to interrupt the illegal entry of fentanyl into our country. And I would treat fentanyl dealers for what they are. They are mass murderers, and they will get life sentences when I'm Prime Minister. But let's be clear, that is not a justification for tariffs. We have guns, drugs, and illegal migrants coming from the United States to Canada. We have never tariffed the Americans for that. If the president wants to fight fentanyl, I agree with him, but I would do it not for President Trump. I would do it for Canadians so that not one more mother gets the knock on the door from a police officer telling her that her son has died in a back alley.
Do you believe that this is about annexing Canada?
Tariff relief support package, whatever you want to call it, require reopening the House and passing legislation. Is this something you're open to doing, even if it requires supporting the Liberals on
Well, we should have had the House open for the last 2 months. Well, we haven't. That's a question for the Liberals. They're the ones that shut down Parliament, and that's why we haven't had those debates.
Last question.
Le président américain a dit que vous êtes.
The
He's not a
US
MAGA guy.
president
I don't like what
said
he says about me. Comment, dans ce contexte, vous
In that
pensez
context,
établir une
how
relation
can you
personnelle
possibly
avec M.
think of
Trump? Ça va être quoi
establishing a
votre
personal
stratégie pour
relationship with Mr. Trump? What will your strategy be?
Mais c'est vrai, je ne suis pas
Well, it's true.
MAGA. Je
I am
suis
not a
pour le
MAGA
Canada,
guy.
le
I'm
Canada d'abord.
for Canada
Je sais
first.
que Mr. Trump ne m'aime pas.
I know that Mr. Trump doesn't like me, and that's
Je ne ferai
fine.
pas pour lui.
I'm not working
Ça
for
m'intéresse
him.
pas d'être aimé
It doesn't interest
par
me
Mr.
to
Trump
be
ou
liked by
personne
Mr. Trump or anyone
Je
else.
suis là pour les Canadiens
I'm here for
d'abord,
Canadians
et je vais
first.
défendre notre pays,
And I will defend
nos
our
emplois,
country, our
notre
jobs,
sécurité et
our
notre
security,
souveraineté,
and
peu
our
importe,
sovereignty.
Ce que des politiciens
Whatever
ailleurs au monde
politicians around the world may think of me.
Well, I'll answer.
Is that what the end game here for Donald Trump?
Let me be clear. I'm going to combine the two questions. The gentleman asked in French about President Trump's comments on me. The president says that he doesn't like me. He doesn't think that I'm a MAGA guy. I am not. It is true that I am Canada first. I am only for Canada. I'm fighting for the interests of this people and this country. And if that upsets foreign leaders, including the American president, I'm fine with that, because I have one job to do, and it's to fight for this country. And let me be also clear. We will never be the 51st state. We will be self-reliant, sovereign, and stand on our own feet. We will be an independent and a sovereign country, and I will always stand up for our flag and our people.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, that is the leader of the official opposition, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, responding to the news today of the tariffs that have now been put in place on Canada and Canada's response in counter tariffs, saying that he wants to make sure that programs are not created out of this that will end up supporting Canadians beyond this crisis. He is calling for targeted support with EI, and he says that the money that is collected from the counter tariffs should be used to cut taxes. Pierre Poilievre also calling for Parliament to be recalled. Remember, it is prorogued until the end of March. The much more likely scenario is probably that we will be in an election before Parliament actually comes back. The CBC's Janice McGregor is still here with me in Ottawa. We've heard from a lot of people since we last spoke, Janice. So just maybe some final thoughts from you on what we're hearing as in terms of a united response, and whether everyone seems to be generally on the same page about what the federal government is doing.
Yeah, that's right. And interesting to see the contrast between a premier like Doug Ford, who just won an election and is now kind of free to plunge into this, versus opposition leader Pierre Poilievre, who is on the cusp of an election. And I think used this opportunity to speak to Canadians on the issue of the tariffs, yes, but also to deliver a version of his stump speech and to try to get the message across that the solutions that he is offering Canadians at this time, the priorities that he says his party would have should they form government, are things that they were thinking about even before the tariffs. And now they see reason, because of the tariffs, to double down on these very same things. So sort of taking the agenda they already had and have been trying to communicate and position for months now, and put it into kind of a very changed context this spring. Interesting to see him deliberately wanting to get that message out at the end in both English and French about how he's not a MAGA guy. I think all of us kind of sort of lean forward to listen closely to that. We, of course, have seen Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau have an adversarial relationship. Should Pierre Poilievre be prime minister? What that relationship would look like, I think, is something a lot of people are wondering as sort of different sort of things move along here. And Poilievre sort of vowing that he has one job to fight, notwithstanding the comparisons some people have made to the style of the politician or the nature of the populism with Poilievre's kind of movement in the Conservative Party. Now he's sort of wanting to make sure that this differentiation is clear for Canadians at a time when they're anxious. And indeed, anxiety, I think, and this, you know, from a party where they still are running TV ads about how Canada is broken, the anxiety kind of in the message from Poilievre and sort of, I understand you're hurting, I understand you're anxious, and I am the solution for that, kind of woven throughout sort of those remarks, I think in a very deliberate way that echoes again the stump speeches we've seen from him for some time now. But a very kind of different response for someone aspiring to an office versus the premiers who are actually sort of in a position to act right away on things, and the tone contrast has been interesting as the morning's gone on here.
Yeah, and also not to discount the fact that the polling environment is changing pretty dramatically in this country right now as well, and Pierre Poilievre, well aware of that, is trying to make sure that Canadians see him as someone who could take on Donald Trump, and that will ultimately, I'm sure, be the ballot box question in the election. I guess a final thought from you, Janice, on what happens next? Is that a fair question? I mean, this is going to, this is going to unfold.
Ones, eh?
I know this is going to unfold, but the Prime Minister seemed optimistic, I will say, in his comments that Canada can withstand this. But I know that it is far from clear how long this is going to go and what the damage will be.
I think from the Canadian side, and I'm not going to pretend to speculate what might happen in terms of U.S. political reaction. No. But in terms of the Canadian side, this is what I would watch for as the day goes on and through the First Minister's meeting and so on. This staging of the response, right? First this, then this, then this. Mm-hmm. It seems like that is not all locked in, that there are still conversations that need to be had. That big card that Doug Ford is kind of pulling out and waving around about electricity, it seems that they haven't figured out the how of that or the timing of that. So what Ontario's doing initially, kind of what he called sort of like the opening response, the pulling the booze off and canceling the contracts, versus kind of the bigger card, what Andrew Fury was pointing out, you don't bring your queen out too soon in chess. The staging of this and getting everyone on the same page, because this is no longer hypothetical. Up till today, when they talked about these things, it was hypothetical. It is not a drill anymore, kids. We're actually kind of mounting this war and getting the generals all together to agree on how we're going to do this, then this on this timeline. Yeah. And as we were talking about earlier, the retaliatory measures, which remember, Canadians in some cases pay, and that's why they are very targeted. And in time of inflation, which everyone is concerned about, balancing that with the need for government to have their backs as workers, as industries, et cetera. Poilievre thinks that anything collected in retaliation should go back in form of tax cuts. I think from others we've heard that could become a point of differentiation in the political debate to come this spring. Do certain groups need subsidies? Do certain groups need targeted investments? Do certain groups need different kinds of helps versus a general kind of, as Poilievre would say, bring it home tax cut for everybody? These are going to be policy differences that are going to be explored in the political debates in the various jurisdictions. And so I think we are going to see a sequencing of things. It won't be all at once. It will be probably, unfortunately, a long battle that plays out over time. And don't skip ahead. Here we are today. There's going to be a lot to work on.
The CBC's Janice McGregor in Ottawa. Thanks for your expertise all morning, Janice.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it very much. I'm going to bring in now the CBC's Katie Simpson in Washington, because there has already been some response to some of the comments from the Prime Minister, Katie.
Yeah, I reached out to the White House to see if there was any reaction from the president or the Trump administration to what Canada had announced. And some of those pointed words that the Prime Minister used in describing this moment, in assessing the shift in geopolitics with, President Trump going after and attacking an ally when at the same time seeming to cozy up with an adversary, being Vladimir Putin of Russia. The White House got back to me and pointed me towards Donald Trump's latest post on Truth Social. And it says, I believe we can bring it up on screen. It says, please explain to Governor Trudeau of Canada that when he puts on a retaliatory tariff on the U.S., our reciprocal tariff will immediately increase by a like amount. There's a couple of things to unpack there. One, again, the governor thing with Donald Trump talking about Canada becoming the 51st state. But the thing that we need to sort of take real close notice of there is about the retaliatory tariff. The original executive order had a retaliation clause that the U.S. Could go forward with by escalating the tariffs even further if Canada, Mexico, or China did decide to retaliate in kind. So that does exist. But we also know that Donald Trump has a series of additional tariffs that he's expecting to roll out in early April, what he calls reciprocal tariffs. Mm-hmm. So if a tariff exists in some other country, Donald Trump and the Trump administration administration plan to impose a reciprocal tariff on those countries, or it's not just tariffs, it could be a whole wide range of non-tariff barriers, things like VAT taxes and taking aim at people that are countries that have digital services taxes, that kind of thing. So the way to sort of, anytime Donald Trump makes a threat like that, the way that we've seen the federal government at least respond to it, they need to actually see the paper. What exactly is it? Is it going to come in the form of an executive order? Is Donald Trump referring to the retaliation clause in that original executive order, or does this relate to what's coming in April? Again, unclear at this moment, and everyone will now be watching to see what Donald Trump has to say later today. It is a very big day for the Trump administration. Donald Trump will be giving sort of, it's not technically a State of the Union address. It's a joint address to Congress. He's just been president for 6 weeks or so now, 5 weeks or so now. So it is a joint statement rather than a State of the Union. And he's really going to be selling his vision to build the economy to Americans, as well as some of the changes he's implemented in the short time since he's returned to the White House. Now, a big thing that Canada and the rest of the world will obviously be watching is what is he going to do or say to sell tariffs to Americans. Americans are expected to be feeling the pinch of this very quickly, but it hasn't set in just yet, right? This is just kicking in right now. And so this is possibly an opportunity for Donald Trump to try and get ahead of it, to try to get his messaging out there before the real economic pain really filters down to Americans. So the things we'll be watching for now: what exactly does Donald Trump mean in terms of escalation? Is it related to the retaliation clause in the original executive order? Is it going to be part of new tariffs coming in April? That kind of thing. And then what is it he's going to say to Americans tonight to try and sell this vision? But again, remember, there are some other really big pressing issues right now in the United States, with the massive change to the federal government, the purge that's underway, the mass firings, the mass layoffs, reduction in spending, that kind of thing, that really has captured the attention of Americans. But make no mistake, if life gets more expensive as expected as a result of these tariffs, if Americans have an even more difficult time trying to buy groceries, trying to pay their rent, trying to pay their mortgage, trying to provide for their children, this will become an acute issue very quickly.
Katie Simpson, thank you. You've got a long day still ahead of you. Thank you for being part of our coverage. As always, we appreciate your expertise there. Thanks. This is CBC's Katie Simpson in Washington. All right, let's just remind you where we are on this extraordinary day in this country's history. Donald Trump went ahead with those 25% tariffs on Canadian exports, 10% on Canadian energy, went into effect at midnight. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau responded, saying that Canada's first round of retaliatory tariffs will total $30 billion. But in the next few weeks, if the tariffs remain in place, it will go up to $125 billion in counter tariffs. And as you know, those counter tariffs will have an impact on you as well. It means that you will pay more for some of the things that the federal government is targeting, things like orange juice, coffee, peanut butter, makeup, footwear, all things that are on this first list, this first tranche that the federal government is doing in order to respond. The Prime Minister also making it clear that there were non-tariff options also on the table. He's expected to discuss some of those with the First Ministers, with the Premiers, at 2 o'clock on a call this afternoon to see if they can be aligned on not only the counter tariffs, but also other things, other points of leverage that could be used by this country, including energy, as we heard from Doug Ford today, the Premier of Ontario, willing to slap tariffs on electricity that is sold to the United States, and even, he says, going so far as to shut it down entirely. The Prime Minister had a series of messages this morning, one directly to Americans, telling them that this was a decision their government made and that it would hurt them. One directly to the President, Donald Trump, saying that this was a dumb idea, and a message to Canadians, saying that he wasn't going to sugarcoat how bad this would be, but it would be challenging and difficult, and that the federal government will be there to support Canadians through employment insurance and other supports for industries through it all. But he made one point very clear. He said that if this is about, if this is a fight with Canada, will not have any winners. And that is the message that he wanted Donald Trump to hear today. Some extraordinary comments, very frank comments from the Prime Minister on this historic day where Canada is now in a trade war with our closest ally. And with that, I'll send things over to Andrew Nichols in Toronto. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks to everyone for their help with their coverage. And of course, our coverage on this remarkable news day continues on CBC News Network.
Rosemary Barton, and as Rosie was saying, this is CBC News Network, and we have extensive coverage planned for you all day on today's extraordinary developments. The Trump administration's America First policy has kicked in with a vengeance. The tariff threats made for so many months are now a reality. Their impact across Canada and the U.S. is likely to be seismic. The Prime Minister spoke this morning. Justin Trudeau said President Trump is trying to orchestrate the total collapse of Canada's economy in an attempt to annex us. He urged Americans to rethink the direction their government and leaders have taken.
So today, the United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. At the same time, they're talking about working positively with Russia, appeasing Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator. Make that make sense. Canadians are reasonable, and we are polite, but we will not back down from a fight. Not when our country and the well-being of everyone in it is at stake.
We're going to Montreal. Quebec Premier François Legault is speaking about the tariffs. Let's listen.
I'm with the Minister of the Economy, Christine Fréchette, and the President of the Treasury Board, Sonia Lebel. Donald Trump has gone ahead with his threats. He has imposed at midnight last night some tariffs to Canadian and Quebec exports, 25% on all products except energy and critical minerals. Apparently, aluminum is included in that. And the tariffs will be at 10%. So already we can see the contrary to what Donald Trump is saying. He can't do without some products. Critical minerals, including aluminum, he can't do without that. So, of course, he's hitting us with 10% instead of 25%. These tariffs, it's clear, will hurt Quebecers, they will hurt Canadians, but they will also hurt Americans. It's important that everybody understand that we're getting into something that is big. Let's talk about Quebec first. We estimate that over 6 months, these tariffs, if they stay in place, we can lose up to 100,000 jobs in Quebec. And if the tariffs stay over 12 months, we will lose 160,000 jobs in total. So, of course, this is something that will be very difficult. And faced with this unjustified attack, well, we have to remain calm. But I have a clear message for Quebecers. We can't just give in. We can't let ourselves be bullied. And it's now time to work together, all Quebecers, so that we can get through this. It's going to be a difficult period, but I'm convinced that we will be able to get through it and come out of it stronger. Within the government for months, Christine and myself, we've been meeting businesses, workers, to see how we can help to protect workers and protect as much as possible the businesses. This morning, we had a special meeting and we adopted a program that is called Frontières, a new program. And I will let Christine Fréchette explain this program to you. Essentially, it's to help businesses to have the liquidity that they need to get through this in the short term. I also want to send a call out to all businesses, all entrepreneurs in Quebec. If you have projects, development projects, projects to diversify the economy, now is the time to go see Investissement Québec. You know, over the past 6 years, we have used Investissement Québec a lot to increase the annual investments. They've been increased by 81%, but our objective is to go even further. We need to diversify our economy and to be less dependent on the U.S. So we need your projects. And all good projects will be looked at by Investissement Québec. Our objective is nothing less than saying what we've done over the past 6 years. We have succeeded in surpassing the economic growth per inhabitant in Canada. There's been an increase in the average salaries, discretionary spending, the increase in productivity. We've surpassed the rest of Canada, but we have to do even more. And we have to continue to have a better performance than the rest of Canada in the years to come. This is something that we're able to do. We have tools in Quebec that the rest of Canada does not have. And I'm speaking of Investissement Québec. A lot of people in the rest of Canada and the other provinces would dream of having a tool like Investissement Québec dedicated just to projects in the province or in the state of Quebec. And we also have another tool that is extraordinary, which is called the Caisse des dépôts et placements du Québec. 400 billion in assets, which has a dual mandate. Jean Lesage, at the time, the mission was to have returns for the pension funds, but also a mission to help the economic development of Quebec. This second mission will be more important than ever. For the past 6 years, we have increased by 47% the assets of the CDPQ. Now, in the next few months and years, I've already asked the CEO of the Caisse des dépôts to do even more. We are really at a turning point with the economy of Quebec. It's not going to be the same in the next few years as what we've seen in the past few years. We are fortunate to have Investissement Québec and the Caisse des dépôts to help us get through this. There's another advantage that we've got in Quebec, and that is the employers and the unions have close relationships. There's the FTQ, the CSN, and we also have two big financial institutions that are very present in the regions of Quebec, Desjardins and the National Bank. So I'm optimistic that we will get through this better than the rest of Canada, through this storm that we've got ahead of us. The other tool that we have in Quebec is Hydro-Quebec. As you know, we believe in the importance of increasing the volume of renewable energy for the long term. Hydro-Quebec has projects for more than 150 billion to double its capacity. It's going to be the biggest project in the history of Quebec. And of course, if we lose 100 or 160,000 jobs, it'll be a good thing to have Hydro-Quebec. Soon we will table the 2025-26 budget, and I've asked the Minister of Finance to accelerate the undertaking of infrastructure projects in education, the schools, in health, the hospitals, in transportation, roads, public transportation. I think it's time to invest in our infrastructure so that we can get through this period that will be difficult. The other thing as well, and this is very important, and I started talking about this with Doug Ford concretely, we have to increase trade with the rest of Canada. We have to break down the interprovincial trade barriers already. I would mention that over the past 6 years, we have increased by 34% our exports to the rest of Canada. It's about the same growth as our exports to the U.S., but now we have to do even more in both directions. And Doug Ford and myself, we have promised that we would work on this concretely, industry by industry, sector by sector. The other thing that's important is that we have to react to Donald Trump. He will not walk away from this with us just crossing our arms and giving up. Earlier, the Prime Minister of Canada confirmed what was agreed upon by all the provinces and territories, that is that there will be counter tariffs on a list of goods that are imported from the U.S. to Canada. So the first list is for $30 billion, and there will be a second list that'll be added in 3 weeks of $125 billion. So this will give some of our businesses a chance to have some latitude so that they can develop products made in Quebec and in Canada that will be more competitive with U.S. products on which there are counter tariffs, because these products, well, the price will be increased by 25%. I also want to say to the businesses in Quebec that we have heard you on some of the inputs. What does that mean? It means that sometimes there are businesses that have products, or in the manufacturing of that product, there's a portion that comes from the U.S. What we're trying to do, and this is difficult work, we're saying if there are some inputs, we have to be able to say if these inputs exist somewhere in Canada, well, we should buy them from Canada. If those inputs do not exist in Canada, at some point we have to ask ourselves a question. Are we going to put a retaliatory tariff on these products imported from the U.S.? I'm thinking about what Sonia Labelle will talk to you about later. I've asked Sonia, in our procurement and our calls for tenders, to penalize, quote unquote, U.S. companies, and she will explain exactly how we'll do this. But of course, we want to give as few contracts as possible. We want them to get win as few calls for tenders.
You've been listening to the Premier of Quebec, François Legault, reacting to the imposition of 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, 10% on Canadian energy products. The Premier of Quebec saying that he is optimistic that Quebec will get through this better than the rest of Canada because there are more supports in place in that province. He also touted Hydro-Quebec, saying that Hydro-Quebec is going to quickly double the amount of output from there, and that will help offset some of the job losses that will come from this trade war triggered by the United States. He also said that he has been speaking with the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, and they are going to work together, that there needs to be more east-west trade, and also that the premiers have agreed with the federal government's imposition of counter tariffs on the United States, $30 billion in this first tranche, and then another $125 billion in another list that will come in a couple of weeks. He said this will give businesses, this is a message to businesses in Quebec and Canada to try and develop products that are made in Quebec and in Canada that will have these tariffs, these counter tariffs put in place. The CBC's Karina Roman joins us live from Ottawa, and so talk to us more about, we're getting, fast and furious, all kinds of reaction from, and we will throughout the day. What stood out for you from what Legault said?
Well, just so much of his message was about how Quebec and Canada can mitigate what will be the tough effects. In Quebec's case, already talking about upwards of 100 to 160,000 jobs to be lost under these tariffs. So he didn't go into detail. That was going to be left to his finance minister, but how there's going to be this new program, a support program, a loan liquidity program for businesses that they've worked out. So I assume we'll get the details eventually on that. That he promoted diversification, other markets, primarily within Canada, in terms of products that are necessary to make Quebec products that might come from the U.S. If there's no Canadian alternative, that perhaps they will consider putting a reciprocal tariff, retaliatory tariff on that. You mentioned the Hydro-Quebec expansion. He talked about how this is the time to invest in infrastructure, echoing some federal leaders that have talked about that, other provincial leaders who have said basically, if we're going to spend money on supporting workers and businesses, maybe part of that could be just to create jobs here. It's not like we don't have crumbling infrastructure in Canada, all provinces, not just Quebec. And he talked about education, roads, bridges, that kind of thing. So perhaps this is going to be that kind of opportunity for those who believe that's where government money and taxpayers' money should go to help mitigate and offset the damaging effects of the tariffs.
All right, and Karina, we did play one clip off the top of the Prime Minister, and he started his news conference today with a clear message, trying to say, here we have Donald Trump slamming tariffs on Canada, close ally and friend, meanwhile seeming to take sides with Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator. Make that make sense. What are some of the other key messages from the Prime Minister today?
There were many, and it was an extraordinary news conference for sure, and speech. He did what he did a month ago and spoke to Americans in his speech, saying that your government has chosen to do this to you, talked about the effects that Americans will feel, whether it's on the markets, which have already taken a tumble, or inflation, jobs. He was elected by the Americans to reverse inflation, to increase jobs, how this will be sabotaging, he said, the goal of this new golden age that Donald Trump had talked about. And then, remarkably, he took an opportunity in his speech to speak to Donald Trump directly, calling him by his first name, talking about the historic CUSMA deal, other big things that they had accomplished together on the world stage. Have a listen to a little bit of that.
Axing taxes, building homes, unleashing construction of our resources, fixing the budget, stopping crime, all of these things.
Okay, obviously that was not the clip of the Prime Minister. That was Pierre Poilievre also reacting today, as everyone is, to that. I don't know if we have the remarkable clip we were going to play of Trudeau, where he basically said to Donald Trump, he doesn't want to have to quote the Wall Street Journal. It doesn't often do that. But in this case, he said, Donald Trump, you are a smart man, or people know you as a smart man, but this is a very dumb thing to do. Those were very blunt words from the Prime Minister. Interestingly enough, I believe CNN and Fox both played part of the Prime Minister's speech live, and I believe that part especially was caught on live American television. He was also very blunt about the whole border fentanyl pretext for these tariffs, calling it a pretext, saying that it might be the legal basis upon which they are basing these tariffs, but it's totally false, that the statistics show that we do not have fentanyl flooding across the northern border into the U.S. Also, look what Canada has done to strengthen the border, to really curb and almost get rid of, I think seizures of fentanyl have gone down 97%. He pointed to the tweets from Donald Trump saying that, again, talking about banks not having access, American banks not having access to Canada, talking about how yesterday Donald Trump talked about how automakers should move to the U.S. So what is this really about? Well, it was finally laid bare in this speech. I don't believe the Prime Minister had been this direct before, saying that he relies on what Donald Trump has actually been consistent about, which is that it's about bashing a Canadian economy so much so that it makes it easier to annex the country and make it the 51st state. Extraordinary revelation or concession or acknowledgement, however you want to characterize it, by the Prime Minister, that he believes that is the real motive behind all of this.
And we're going to get that clip. I have the transcript. We're going to get it. We're just, know, it's been so busy today. Every day is an extraordinary day. So sometimes there's just little issues with getting the clip, but we'll get the clip. But this is exactly what what he had to say because I think people should know. He said,
absolutely. I do not have it transcribed in front of me.
No.
Okay.
I just have it because I was sort of highlighting some of the moments. We have to, this is what the Prime Minister had to say, we have to fall back on the one thing he has said repeatedly, that what he wants to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy, referring to Donald Trump, because that will make it easier to annex us, and that is never going to happen. We will never be the 51st state. He just goes on to say, I'll just read a little bit more, but he can do damage to the Canadian economy, and he has started that this morning, but he will rapidly find out, as American families will find out, that it will hurt people on both sides of the border. So that is quite an extraordinary statement. You know, as you say, Karina, refuting the fentanyl because the statistics just don't bear that out. American White House officials can go on and on and on about how, you know, there's, you know, one is too many, but it doesn't really constitute, I think, in the minds of many, a national emergency, a crisis. And that in the Prime Minister's assessment of this all, he's known Donald Trump for a while. He's only going to be Prime Minister for another few days. That this is really all about the 51st state, and Donald Trump himself has said it, right? He wants to use economic coercion to absorb us into becoming the 51st state.
And you know what was interesting is that acknowledgement of what it's really about was also what the Prime Minister explained is why, when he was asked, should we just maybe open up renegotiations of CUSMA then? And he said, well, pretty difficult to negotiate with a partner who this is their goal. What are you negotiating? How do you do that in good faith? Not that he's not open to that if that's the road down which the U.S. wants to go for real, but very hard to actually embark on negotiations with what is essentially a bad faith negotiating partner. So it was interesting that he used that. How do you negotiate with someone whose goal is to actually ruin your economy as opposed to have a win-win situation, which is what trade deals are usually about. And so that is why, after all those extraordinary acknowledgements, he did get into the substance of what the counter tariffs are going to look like, what kind of other things that they're thinking of doing. He does have a call with the premiers this afternoon to discuss non-tariff measures as well.
Okay, yeah, so do you want to get, I was going to ask you kind of moving ahead, but let's not move ahead. Let's talk a little bit about what those countermeasures, just sort of generally speaking, what they are. This $30 billion, this is the first tranche, and let's even put aside for a moment some of what the provinces have been doing. There is liquor coming off the shelves in Ontario, in Newfoundland, I think in Nova Scotia. This is just off the top of my head.
Quebec, I think,
in
as well.
Quebec, that's right. In Quebec, there's the threat of imposing an export tax for Ontario electricity going to a few American border states, 25%. So what about, though, this first tranche?
So that's the first tranche. Is this $30 billion on targeted products coming into Canada from the United States. I think we've talked about what those look like. There's a long list on the government website. I believe Florida orange juice is in there, and Kentucky bourbon. Then there's $125 billion to be done within 3 weeks if the tariffs do not come off. But the non-tariff measures, the Prime Minister was much more cagey about that. He did talk about procurement, contracts at all different levels of government, certainly something they're looking at. But when asked directly about whether he would support an export tax on other energy like oil and gas, which at this point faces a 10% American tariff, whether that's something he's open to, he said two things that indicate he's not going to give us an answer on that until certainly after talks with the premiers. One is that, yes, they don't want any one sector, any one province to bear the brunt more harshly than others. And right now you would say maybe looking at the tariffs that are in place from the states, the auto sector is certainly going to be hit very, very hard as opposed to the energy sector, which is facing a 10%, and critical minerals, which is facing a 10%. So should there be a top-up export tax, perhaps, on those products that we export to the U.S.? He did not want to go down that road because he also said what's really important is unity. More than anything else, if we start to fight amongst ourselves, then we've lost. And let the fighting amongst themselves happen in the United States, he said, which is already happening. We need to stay unified. So it is going to be a challenge to hit back hard, as some premiers and federal leaders want, and also stay unified, because we know, at least in the past, Alberta has not been on board with an export tax.
Okay, so Karina, let's just talk a little bit about the future, because Justin Trudeau will not be Prime Minister in 5 days from now. There will be a new Liberal leader. Generally speaking, they all have been on board, it seems, with where the federal government is going, with this $30 billion, the top leadership candidates, right, more or less. So what does that mean if you basically can't negotiate with Donald Trump because his goal is to ruin us economically and try and make us into the 51st state? I mean, what do you do?
I do think that's probably why you have the Liberal leadership candidates on board, or even wanting more than what the federal government is doing, because it's not really about negotiating with Donald Trump. It's maybe not even about convincing Donald Trump anymore. It's about convincing the American people that this is bad, who can then convince Donald Trump, please stop doing this. Certainly the markets might do that. The business in America might do that as well. Some of the leaders, maybe even all of them, have really pushed for dollar-for-dollar retaliation, so they may even go stronger. I do want to just, not correct, but there's a bit more nuanced on when he stops being Prime Minister, because he was actually asked that today, and he said that'll really depend on a conversation with whoever the new leader is and himself in terms of transition. So he could still be Prime Minister on Monday or even Tuesday, but yes, it's certainly, the end is near in terms of his tenure as Prime Minister, for sure. But I just want people to realize it might not be this hard cutoff on Sunday.
I was unclear about that, because I was,
I guess so were you, and that's why it was asked at the scrum, how will that work and what is the timing on that? So the other question he was asked was about helping workers and businesses, because the government keeps saying that there is going to be a program, but people are, of course, looking for specifics, because from what we hear, there are some places shutting down production now. There are jobs being lost now. So the Prime Minister did say that, the first priority was to avoid the tariffs. That didn't happen. The number one priority now, other than unity, is to try and get those tariffs off as quickly as possible. But he says, of course, over the last month, they have worked on a program, and it would be, an expansion of EI, making employment insurance more flexible. There will be some sort of direct support to businesses. But as I said, he was scant on specifics, and so was really the employment minister, who was also today. I don't know if we have that clip, because he was out today, so you can tell me, control room, whether we have that clip or not. But Stephen McKinnon saying today that okay, we do not have the clip, so I'll tell you what he said. The response will be robust, but don't expect this response to be like it was during the pandemic. That this is a different situation. With the pandemic, the economy essentially just shut off overnight. This is more of a rolling effect. And so expect whatever programs they are going to reveal in the next few days will be tailored to this situation. That's the specifics we have for today. I don't know how revelatory that is to our audience, but it's not going to be these massive CERB programs that we remember from the pandemic, but there will be help. And interesting that when you hear from Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, was also out reacting today. One of the things he said, if he were Prime Minister, he would focus more on tax breaks as opposed to support programs. So you can see that, since we don't know who the next Liberal leader will be, and we don't know whether we're going to be heading into an election, there will be a lot of things to figure out, not just in terms of a response to the tariffs, but a response to how people at home and businesses at home are helped through this situation.
And we'll get all those clips sorted out, and we'll have them soon. Because you're with us all afternoon, Karina. I appreciate that. The CBC's Karina Roman live in Ottawa. So let's go back to Quebec for more on the tariffs. The CBC's Sarah Levitt is in Lacolle at the border crossing there with New York State. We heard from the Premier earlier in the show, but he continues to speak this hour, and we're learning more about Quebec's response. What can you tell us?
Well, Premier François Legault really going at this in two ways. The first is how Quebec, as a province, can retaliate or as he put it in one of his sentences, punish the U.S. for these tariffs that they have put in place. And he looked at many options that the province could take, number one being following along with what other provinces have done, and that is taking American liquor off the shelves of our liquor board, the SAQ. And so Legault saying that's going to happen immediately. Another retaliation that he has put out there is punishment to American companies that bid on things here in Quebec who don't have any connection to Quebec. So whether that be a factory in Quebec or partnerships with businesses in Quebec. He called it a punishment, a monetary punishment if they do want to do business here in the province, and he said that that could go up to 25%. Now, the other the other vein that he took was how Quebec and his government are going to help businesses as they deal with these tariffs. And he announced a loan, interest-free loan program, and they're calling it frontière, so that means border, and not going into too much detail, but saying that businesses in Quebec can apply for this interest-free loan to help them deal with the issue of the tariffs. And they said that businesses could get up to $50 million in help. Here's what Legault said specifically about what he's been doing this past month. He said, over the past few weeks, I have met with several small, medium, and large businesses active in our strategic sectors to better understand their specific realities, and I'm convinced that the measures put forward will address some of their challenges.
Okay, so that's what he had to say. I want to ask you, Sarah, there you are. Speaking of the border, you're at the border. We're seeing lots of traffic there behind you. Have you spoken to people? Do you have a sense of what's happening in terms of these tariffs going into place? Are trucks being looked at and do you have any sense of what's going on there?
So what I will say, Andrew,